Well, I could tell more, but I will talk too long.
Well, the gigant itself.
The gigant itself. Dr. Eckner was interested in taking over this project. Since his company was still tied to aviation by the Zeppelins, he wanted also his port mechanics from the Zeppelins to be connected with the flight project. So, since I was at that time in charge of it, I had an interview with Dr. Eckner in the luxurious hotel where the passengers of the Zeppelin stayed overnight before they flew across to South America or North America on a regular schedule. And I remember him sitting there and talking with me. And I said, I have to tell you, much as I want to join you, I tell you that I have political difficulties. And I told him why. Because in our ancestors there were some Jewish people. And he got a red face and said, I couldn't care less if you are a good man, I want you. And then, with his red face, he started in a tirade against Hitler. And he called him loudly, in the presence of all the other guests, a criminal, ein Verbrecher. And I put my hand on him and said, let's talk about Zigigard. But the people all loved him. And Nobody
turned him in.
Turned him in, yeah. But that's how he was. He became my boss. And we moved the whole operation to Friedrichshafen. And occasionally, we flew practically every day. Occasionally, he showed quietly up in his Maybach limousine, because the Maybach Motors had delivered the motors for the Zeppelin. And they became part of the Eckner's concern. Dornier, by the way, also. So we are all under Eckner. So he showed up at the airport with his stick. My stick has disappeared. No, I don't need it. I saw him outside of our hangars, etc. He just stood there and watched our huge airplane. And he told me, he said, well, if I can't have a Zeppelin, at least I want to have the biggest airplane in the world. And so we made practically every day a flight. There was need for the transporter for Rommel in Africa, because he was cut off and he needs supplies. And they formed, I don't know how you call it, battalion or something, of 13 or 14 gigants. And I was, as a civilian, to go with them in case there were problems. And that is a story in itself, but I won't tell you that. I will tell you about what happened when we got the flutter case.
Yeah.
We had discovered the flutter tendency of the Gigant before, and we were able to control it. The wing fluttered, but very slowly, and we could control the speed and the flutter movement. And when the engineers and scientists heard about it, they came in masses to our place to fly on board and measure whatever they wanted to understand the flutter problem.
Yeah.
People like Kiesling,
Yeah.
and of course my friend Stender,
Yeah.
and we wrote then a joint paper on it, what the flutter problem is for gliders. Since after all it was a big glider. But that was still controlled. Now, the catastrophe that happened had to do with another project on the Gigant, namely Dornier. You know the Dornier works, Phil, yeah? Had developed a fantastic fighter plane, I think it was a turboprop, that was practically sonic flying. And they had developed a parachute, a huge parachute, which was supposed to catch in the case of a mishap, to catch not only the crew, but the whole airplane. So it was a very big parachute. And now we had to test the parachute first. So what Dornier did was they built a mock-up of this with the same weight. It was somewhere between 12 and 14 tons or so, I think. That's the order of magnitude I remember. So we had to rebuild the Gigant to get a big hole in the middle of the fuselage. And the mock-up had the shape of the fighter. And we were supposed to drop it. The first time we tried to drop it, we dropped it into the Lake of Constance.
Yeah.
And the people didn't like that because all the traffic of boats on the Lake of Constance had to be stopped for this attempt. And also the parachute didn't open, fell into the lake. So we went to another place in Württemberg, near Stuttgart. And there was an area that belonged to the army but was not used, and they had an airfield. And this is where we wanted to make the first test with the revamped payload. So there was another story before, but it takes too much time, so I ignore it. I remember we started at 2 o'clock. Everybody on board was instructed by the Dornier engineers about this big payload and what they had to do when it was dropped. I remember my question was, when I asked him, what happens if the wing loading of the plane changes abruptly by the weight loss?
Oh, yeah, right.
And he said they studied that and it wouldn't do any harm. And there were a number of people on board that were from Dornier that I didn't know. But we also had our own crews. And our chief pilot, who was a close friend of mine, was a pilot on this, and I was his co-pilot as usual. And the third person, that was a friend of the three of us. We had flown so many 100 missions that we were close friends. He was our radio operator. He was sitting behind me. So we went up. This plane couldn't go very high, but the highest we could make was about 7 kilometers. What is that, 23,000 feet or so?
Yeah.
It was around 25,000 feet. Then the engines got somewhat tired. And so we went up like we had done before. And we came to altitude. And Walter, the chief pilot, my friend, sitting next to me, said, Jaak, why don't you take over, because I want to see what happens to the payload. So I need to make a left turn.